In this week's episode of Bleach, the 1000-Year Blood War arc, Yachiru reveals her peculiar Shikai, Kenpachi takes on Sternritter v Gremmy, and an enormous Meteor threatens to wipe out the Seirete. Well, here we are. This is a big one. We've had Renji versus Masked Demasculine, we've experienced Rukia versus Asnod, but as far as the first half of the second Quincy invasion goes, there's no denying this is the biggest show of the lot. After all, Kenpachi vs Gremmy is an entire volume unto itself in the source material. It's an enormous, explosive, fan-favourite fight that, in my opinion, was always going to be tough to adapt in a satisfying way. There's a ton of unique and unusual visuals and abilities being thrown around in this fight, while at the same time acting as the vehicle for Kenpachi's long-awaited Shikai reveal. Plus, it's the watershed moment that sees the overall tides of the battle change significantly afterwards. Until now, the war has been structured in a fairly neat way, but once this fight is over, things start to go a bit crazy, a bit off the rails, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that chaos unleashed. But this is a big fight in general, not just because of how long it is, but it provides us with several major touchstones of Zaraki's development, from his acceptance of his new title to that pivotal reveal of Nozarashi itself under the burning sky. It's also a weird fight for reasons I've opined before. The fact that such prominence is given to Gremmy as an enemy, but Gremmy lives and dies within this fight and this fight alone. He has no backstory, virtually no context, nothing. He's the perfect example of a character that exists within a vacuum for one specific purpose: to be the engine of that Nozarashi reveal. But there's plenty to cover here in this review, so let's get on with it. As we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1000-Year Blood War episode 20, I Am the Edge. As always, I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read the entirety of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the whole arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and of course what it took away from the source material. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week, and if you enjoyed the video when you're done with it, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to say an enormous thank you and a massive shout out to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. Alright, I've been waiting for this one. The rumours were true. Before the core began, I predicted that this fight would be split across 2 episodes, but that's not the case. The entire fight begins and ends this week, meaning we're covering a huge number of chapters, over double what I once considered the sweet spot of chapter coverage within a single episode. The majority of this episode is covering a fight, yes, which normally I'd say helps make the situation better, but I think for the first time we're seeing the anime team push the slack that they're afforded to the absolute max this week, and we're treated to overall what feels like a pretty lean fight as a result. So these are the chapters covered in episode 20. Chapter 571, A Devilish Perspective. Chapter 572, The Blaster. 573, I Am the Edge, the title of the episode. Chapter 574, Death in Vision. Chapter 575, The Killer's High. 576, The Killer's High 2. 577, Blade. Chapter 578, The Undead 5, and finally the first half of Chapter 579, The Undead 6. And so, clocking in at 8.5 chapters covered total, episode 20 is an absolutely indisputable beast, and is definitely the most jam-packed episode of the 1000-Year Blood War arc to date. Obviously, there's been a lot of discourse surrounding the pacing of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime pretty much ever since it began, but the fact this episode covered so many chapters in one go isn't immediately a call for concern, nor is it immediately a bad thing. However, I would argue that this episode in particular does feel a little like it's bursting at the seams. There certainly isn't much in the way of added content this time, that's for sure. Instead, pieces have had to have been chipped away here and there to try and squeeze this episode into its allotted space. But let's dive into the episode itself, as there's evidently a lot to look at. So we begin this episode with chapter 571, which is also the first chapter of volume 64, Death in Vision, which feels like a fitting place to begin, as this episode will cover almost the entire volume in one fell swoop, which is pretty crazy. It feels like they've condensed Gremmy's existence down even further in that sense. Originally he just appeared in the one volume, but now he's just appearing in the one episode, outside of the Sternritter meeting, that is. Anyway, the episode opens at the start of chapter 571, with Isane suddenly realising Yachiru is injured and rushing over to her. Considering I originally wasn't sure that Gwenaël would even make the cut, his fight plays out fairly faithfully for the most part, which I'm glad about, as his powers were always very interesting and surprisingly well thought out for such a bit part player. There are mostly only small lines and dialogue exchanges cut here and there. For example, at the start of this interaction in the chapter, Isane identifies Gwenaël as a member of the Sternritter, to which he says he doesn't know how many times he's going to have to repeat this introduction. That particular back and forth is removed. Gwenaël even gets a splash screen, which is interesting considering he really isn't a real Sternritter and didn't get any kind of formal introduction like this in the source material. This section does move pretty quickly, however, but I actually think it's quite an effective means of showing Gwenaël's powers in action. For example, when Yachiru lands a punch here, in the chapter you can linger on that panel for as long as you like, but in the episode he vanishes in a split second, which is how it would appear to Yachiru as well, so you really feel the effect of what it must be like to fight against him. The overall explanation of Gwenaël's ability is slimmed down quite a bit, however. In the original chapter, the character espouses a detailed breakdown of his ability through an internal monologue. Probably what Rose should have done, am I right? Explaining the three forms of the vanishing point, his so-called shrift. Gwenaël explains that in version 1 his form disappears, while in version 2 his existence disappears. He even goes so far as to detail what happens in the liminal states found between the forms, revealing that as he transitions into version 2, all that's left behind of him is an illusion, and he can strike enemies while invisible as well. All of this ability exposition and how it benefits him in battle is gone in the anime. In the episode, Gwenaël merely mentions that his power has the three distinct versions. I forgot how injured Yachiru actually is by Gwenaël during this battle, but what's cool about Yachiru here is how level-headed she remains, even once Gremmy arrives and begins breaking her bones. Throughout the entire ordeal, she remains as calm as she can be, which is a great moment for an often childish character. When the situation calls for her to be serious, she understands that, and she can be in the blink of an eye. However, as Yachiru's reactions begin to get faster, Gwenaël activates version 3 of his power, allowing him to remove all traces of existence from his enemies' minds. In layman's terms, they forget about him, essentially. In the original chapter, the visual of his essence transforming into a strange wisp-like ghost is really great, and I'm glad to see it was handled equally well in the anime too. And like I said in my reaction, the spectral green glow of Isane's barrier helps douse the scene in a spooky feeling all round. Although Gwenaël's internal thoughts are mostly cut, including how fun he finds tricking and slicing up Yachiru, I like the addition of his ghostly form having a wicked grin before the opening begins. As the fight continues, Yachiru tries to hit Gwenaël again, this time without having any idea who he is. This causes Isane to protest that Yachiru can't try to attack someone without knowing who they are first, to which Yachiru simply says she got the tingles from looking at him. Unfortunately, all of Gwenaël's thoughts are removed here again, which included some funny moments where he commentates on the conversation between the two vice-captains without their knowledge, siding with Isane when she scolds Yachiru, and balking at Yachiru's animal-like nature in battle. While this is a comedic moment ultimately, it's also cool characterization for Gwenaël. He's in his element here, able to spectate his enemies, and you realise, of course, that his power is working exactly as intended against Isane. In fact, Gwenaël goes so far as to angrily insult Yachiru's actual appearance, saying her pink hair isn't befitting of a young girl and her face has a mountain-like wildness to it. Of course, it makes sense that Gwenaël is infuriated by Yachiru. Someone who fights purely based on instinct is the perfect counter to his power. But it also adds another layer to this supporting villain too. He sees himself as a hunter, stalking his prey while invisible, and this is supported by the way he tries to take out Yachiru, cowardly trying to stab her from behind while her back is turned. I do love the characterization for Yachiru herself though. She is incredibly beast-like, retrieving her zanpakuto and drawing it, the blade gleaming in her eyes as she says she's going to slay Gwenaël. It's a great juxtaposition too, this girl's murderous intent being so fierce, yet her sword is bright pink with a flowery guard. I'm really glad the anime kept her fight in, since it's the only one she actually gets. Anyway, as Gwenaël tries to stab Yachiru, she twists round and slices at him. Though he seems to dodge it successfully, a slash appears on his nose as Yachiru reveals her zanpakuto's ability. It's a copycat sword with a hidden blade on the front and the back that swing both before and after she does. She then reveals Sanpo Kenju, and the two enormous, strange, almost hollow-like creatures also wielding blades standing behind her. With that, Yachiru and her creatures cut Gwenaël in half, ending chapter 571. As we begin 572, and Yachiru dances with Sanpo Kenju, Isane looks on in wonder at the strange sight. Just what is this zanpakuto? It's like no Shikai Isane has ever seen before. She directly compares it to two other Shikai that also summon other creatures into being in different ways. Unohana's Shikai, which transforms the blade itself into a giant ray, and Hitsugaya's Shikai, which actively creates ice that then becomes a dragon. Here, Yachiru's blade hasn't changed at all, and Isane speculates that she hasn't actually materialized her zanpakuto spirits like Shinigami do in order to achieve bankai either. So, what exactly is going on here? Well, that's just it. Nothing. Nothing is happening here at all. Yachiru is wielding an empty blade. Nothing is happening because what Isane is witnessing isn't Shikai. While we don't know what Sanpo Kenju is for certain, based on the truth of Yachiru as we will come to know it, it seems likely to me that the beasts of Sanpo Kenju are just materializations of even more of Zaraki's Reiatsu, that either Yachiru herself is conjuring, or he is subconsciously conjuring to protect her. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, just look at Sanpo Kenju's ability. It forms a protective layer essentially on either side of Yachiru herself, and these two creatures do give off the feeling of being her guardians almost. Now, I said at the start of the video there might be spoilers for the entire arc to come, and here is one such spoiler, so I'm warning you again in advance now. But we know that Yachiru is actually the bankai spirit of Kenpachi's zanpakuto, Nozarashi, hence why she's able to just hand him bankai so easily later on. So either these creatures are Nozarashi's Shikai spirit, which is highly unlikely, or, like I said, they're just additional creations born of Zaraki's overflowing power. But of course, let me know your thoughts down in the comments too as well. However, as Gwenaël reveals he survived Yachiru's strike, more of his dialogue is removed in the episode. In the original chapter, he follows this up by revealing an ability of his called the Vanishing Slider, which allows him to essentially phase backwards, allowing him to dodge extremely quickly. Either way, Gwenaël's time is up. Out of nowhere, an entire chunk of his body is blinked out of existence as the true enemy of the week is revealed. Gremmy Arrives, the real Sternritter V, sits casually inside Isane's barrier. As Gwenaël pleads for his life, the anime adds a nice, new, disturbing detail where he reaches out to Gremmy. And the next scene is handled very well as well, I think. As Gremmy states Gwenaël has been erased from his memory, Gwenaël, seemingly realising his fate, rages at his creator and lunges for him, generating a dagger of Reiatsu in his hand. Honestly, it's really expertly done, I think. There's a sense of desperation, but also of futility too. Gremmy's callous nature comes across wonderfully in his voice actor's soft-spoken tone. This is a person who thanks to his power, doesn't understand the value of life at all and instead frequently toys with it. And just like that, Gremmy claims to no longer be able to imagine a future for Gwenaëlle, causing Gwenaëlle's body to be obliterated, bursting like a balloon in a violent shower of blood and guts. Like I said in my reaction, it is kind of funny how there is such an explosive shower of gore, yet none of it manages to land on Isane, though I do like the small detail of Gwenaëlle's blood and entrails and whatever, all fading away as he just disappears from Gremmy's imagination entirely. But I have so many other questions as well, to which I know I'll probably never get answers. But when did Gremmy create Gwenaëlle? Was it just for the second Quincy invasion, or was it long before that? And Gwenaëlle seems to have some semblance of free will and to be a being totally unto himself. But he must have just presumably appeared one day, so does he realise that? Does he use that Gremmy is his creator? Did Gremmy give him instruction? It implies to me that Gremmy created him and told him he was a Sternritter and never actually explained the truth. But even then, I don't know why he would do that. But then Gwenaëlle not only isn't present at the Sternritter meeting, he isn't present when Yhwach orders them all to witness his announcement earlier either. So maybe he really was created right before the battle began. Existential questions like these are posed again in the supplementary material when it's revealed that the Sternritter Shaz Domino is also one of Gremmy's creations, something that I actually expected to be brought up here in this episode, especially since Kubo never drew Shaz a piece of memorial art, yet Gwenaëlle gets one this week. Perhaps Shaz will pop up again in the anime later on down the line, or the greater likelihood is that he's simply being forgotten once again. Anyway, Isane demands that Gremmy leave the barrier and the captain's sides at once, her voice actress delivering an unexpectedly powerful cry, but Gremmy claims to have already killed them. In the anime, Isane seemingly just takes his word for it, but in the original chapter she darts into the barrier immediately and performs a check, a small Kido spell of sorts, revealing that Rose and Kensei indeed have no heartbeat. I'd have liked to have spent more time with this moment, to be honest, in both the anime and the original chapter. I mean, as far as Isane is concerned, she's just seen the two captains in her care die before her very eyes, with there being nothing she could have done to prevent it. It was a really shocking moment back in the day. Again, this sequence is fairly faithful to the source material, just with a few small cuts here and there. For instance, when Yachiru lunges for Gremmy and he dodges out of the way, in the anime he doesn't say anything, whereas in the original chapter he mocks Yachiru. And that's an interesting moment to me as well. Later on, Gremmy is characterised as having little to no battle experience, and that being a crucial weakness of his, yet here he's able to casually anticipate and avoid Yachiru's strike, all the while talking down to her about it, and we know that she's a pretty accomplished fighter too. In both versions though, there's a blankness to Yachiru's stare that helps really hammer home how dire this scene has quickly become. I also love how the anime focuses on Yachiru's arm twisting and warping in a gruesome fashion. It actually made me think of Pernida a bit, who also has a power I'm excited to see adapted in the future. Gremmy quickly turns the tables on Yachiru, transforming the bones of both of her arms into cookies, which is actually really messed up when you stop to think about it, before advancing on her and revealing his ability. Anything he imagines becomes reality. Yes, it really is perhaps the most stupidly unshackled ability in Bleach, but there's a certain novelty that comes with that as well. I like how the anime adapts Yachiru's horrified expression too, giving it this weird fisheye effect, as it really emphasises how much disbelief she's actually in, having heard that. But as we reach the end of chapter 572, a massive explosion blows a hole in the roof of the building, and Kenpachi Zaraki arrives. While I think the art looks perfectly good here, I'm a little disappointed there's no music or really anything to signify his appearance. The whole scene feels a little bit undercooked in that sense, especially considering we haven't seen Kenpachi since his fateful battle with Unohana. That being said, I do like the way Yachiru's eyes glisten when she sees him. It was a nice moment for the two of them. Now though, with Zaraki's timely entrance, the episode truly begins, and I have a feeling it'll cover a lot of material in not a lot of time. As we begin chapter 573, Kenpachi leaps down into the room. Now, while I mentioned I was a little disappointed at the lack of music for Kenpachi's arrival, this next scene works very well for having no music in it at all. Isane asks about Unohana, but of course Kenpachi flatly reveals that she's dead and he killed her. Isane crumples to the floor and Kenpachi says if she hates him for it, she can go ahead and kill him. I mentioned in my live reaction that I think this moment works really well without music because it's not supposed to be a big triumphant moment. It's more akin to the solemn sadness we felt when Komamura revealed his new transformations. We realised there was no going back. This is a similar moment. Unohana is fully confirmed to be dead. Although Kenpachi is back on the scene, it's not without some serious caveats. And personally, I think this is a really interesting moment for Kenpachi that shows a lot of growth, and also reveals a lot about how he feels regarding the killing of the woman he admired so much. He doesn't tell Isane to try and kill him in a way that would beget a challenge, he simply says she can go ahead and do it. To me, while he knows that Isane would never actually act on it, he accepts responsibility for it nonetheless and wouldn't be surprised if she hated him. In fact, he'd understand it. He expects feelings of retribution and it's just a really good moment all round. But of course, despite how she may feel in her heart, truthfully Isane is glad that Kenpachi managed to kill Unohana, as now Unohana is freed of her bloodied title, of her 1,000-year-old shackles, to which Kenpachi confirms. This is a really weighty moment, and I appreciate the anime doing its best to imitate Kubo here, never revealing Zaraki's face, never betraying his true thoughts and emotions, only cloaking it in shadow instead. It's very good and handled really well. It's a shame that after this moment, Isane mostly goes completely missing in action for a while, as a potential dynamic between herself and Zaraki could have been interesting to see play out. As Gremmy confronts Kenpachi, he conjures an enormous stage for the two of them to do battle on that rises up high above the field of war. Rose and Kensei's corpses fall over the side, and Isane leaps after them, removing her from the equation. There is something kind of funny about seeing the two of them bandaged up like a pair of mummies, hurtling downwards headfirst like some rockets or something, but regardless, this is the last we'll see of Isane for a while unless she gets some new scenes. And speaking of new scenes, I hope we get to see what becomes of her. Because, again, spoilers for another upcoming fight, but Giselle has Kensei and Rose in her possession when it comes time for her to battle Mayuri. So, where and when did she steal their corpses? Did she actively confront Isane, or did she spirit them away from under her nose somehow? It would be really nice to see how that actually played out. That's the sort of missing piece I'd rather get than the extended fight between, say, Mask and Hisagi Yukaku and Yumachika, which was nice but ultimately wasn't really necessary on the whole. Now, it's cool that like the Sternritter execution ground from last week, the stage is actually named here in the anime as the Seirete Stone Fort. A couple of small details that I appreciate. First, as I mentioned in my live reaction, I like that the red glow on the characters is intensified now they are closer to the veil itself. And the red sky works really well here too, coating the stage in a darkly blood-soaked hue. Secondly, and this is in the original Chapter 2, but I appreciate that Gremmy has done his reading here. He notes that Kenpachi Zaraki is famous, so he's likely read up on his Dayton even while being locked away. Gremmy then gets his splash screen as he says that he thinks Kenpachi is lucky to be able to fight him, as he believes he's the strongest Sternritter of them all. Kenpachi, however, steps forward and slams his blade onto Gremmy's shoulder, but the Quincy blocks the strike in a shower of sparks, claiming to have made his skin stronger than steel simply by imagining it to be so. However, despite this, Kenpachi forces his blade down harder and manages to slice right through Gremmy regardless, splattering the ground with blood. Now here we see the first of Gremmy's personality flaws that prevents him from reaching his true potential as the supposed strongest Sternritter. Although Gremmy will become more animated as the fight progresses, right now he's extremely lethargic, barely moving from the spot and expecting to take on Kenpachi by simply standing there and weathering his attacks with his hands in his pockets. However, as he does so often, Kenpachi immediately upends that expectation, forcing Gremmy down onto one knee and most likely forcing him to reevaluate his situation immediately. See, Gremmy's power, the ability to turn fantasy into reality simply by imagining it, is undeniably one of the most incredible in Bleach. On the surface, it appears to be technically limitless, unbounded, and without drawback. But Kubo actually utilises the visionary in a way that's quite clever, and affords it a few organic weaknesses in doing so, the main one being Gremmy himself. Now that Gremmy has been given the strength to achieve whatever he wants, he also has nothing. Many people have said, well, why doesn't Gremmy just imagine Kenpachi dead from the start? And while I imagine he probably could do that, or could at least imagine a situation where Kenpachi was crippled and unable to fight, Gremmy undergoes a short but effective character arc in the space of his battle with Kenpachi, which prevents him from doing that. We'll discuss Gremmy's character arc more as we go along, but this version of Gremmy, before he is successfully struck by Kenpachi, is the one most likely to simply imagine his opponent's death, because that level of separation and power is all he's ever currently known. However, when Kenpachi is able to break through his steel skin and wound him, it's an open challenge to Gremmy's supremacy, one that he's never really had before, and it awakens something inside him. Something that would never want this prospective fight to be over that fast. And so we get the battle as it plays out ahead of us. Had Kenpachi been unable to pierce Gremmy in that first moment, I think Gremmy would have quickly grown bored and maybe would have been more inclined to just end the fight there and then, as it would be playing out like every other encounter he's ever had. Anyway, Kenpachi scolds Gremmy, telling him that his imagination can't create a single thing that he can't cut through, as we reach the cliffhanger for chapter 573, and Kenpachi announces himself officially as the Kenpachi. Again, as I said in my live reaction, I did an entire episode of Bleach the best scenes on this moment, as it really does feel like a watershed moment for Kenpachi himself. We then get the title of the episode, appearing in a really striking way, each individual word flashing up on the screen as we see Zaraki's blade reflected in his eye, the jagged, chipped edge of the sword gleaming in the light. Now, I want to talk about the information key cards for a moment, as Gremmy's one actually does mention that he's been kept locked in a special cage by Yhwach deep within Silburn. But to be honest, I don't really know why they included this, as no character in the episode ever mentions that Gremmy was locked up, plus in the anime we see him both at the Sternritter meeting and at Yhwach's announcement, so they can't have been that bothered about having him there with them. It's possible we might get a little something next week, maybe, but I really wish we'd even had just a single shot, a flash, showing us Gremmy just existing within his cage. I think it's harder to get a grip of who Gremmy is and what his existence is really like in the anime, as so much context surrounding him has been removed. Now he's kind of just some weird guy who shows up and gets beaten in the same week. As we begin the next chapter, we get to see the reaction of Squad 11 itself down below, as they suddenly realise Kenpachi has finally arrived on the battlefield, thanks to the tremor of his Reiatsu. This is the closest we've come to that Reiatsu sensation effect back in the anime. I still don't know why they seemingly removed it, and I also like the detail that they've included the character Maki Maki here too, from the Soul Society arc. Seeing familiar faces among the officer grunts was something Kubo did really well, particularly in the first invasion, but Maki Maki, despite being a recurring named character in that arc, never showed up again, so it's cool to see him here. I also like that these officers are still here, because Akon never bothered to contact them alongside everyone else. Meanwhile, back atop of the stage, Gremmy imagines his wound is miraculously healed, surprising Kenpachi. A scene from the original chapter is removed next, where the soldiers down below think it's weird that since Kenpachi must have been on that platform for some time now, how comes they've only just felt his spiritual pressure? While I can understand why this scene was cut, it's a bit of a shame too, as it's a nice bit of foreshadowing that something significant has happened to Kenpachi, to the point where his once constantly overflowing Reiatsu now appears to be under control. However, Gremmy promises to kill Kenpachi without even using a finger, summoning a plume of lava which then rushes towards the captain. Like I said, despite a few cuts here and there, the actual fight plays out almost identically to the source material. Kenpachi slices through the wave of lava, sending boiling hot streams flying across the battlefield, almost hitting Yachiru. I really like the shock and anger in Kenpachi's voice, as he can't understand why Yachiru hasn't left the fight quite yet putting herself in danger. Now, I've only just realised this, but it's a little weird that Zaraki just seemingly completely ignores Yachiru after finding out that her bones are now made entirely of cookies and leaps at Gremmy instead. Kenpachi finds himself encased within a cube of water in midair, and the anime adds a great new detail here. As Kenpachi finds himself suspended in the sky, he looks down and sees an immobile Yachiru falling into an enormous chasm that Gremmy has opened up. It's hard to tell if Kenpachi then forces the water downwards in an effort to chase after Yachiru, or if Gremmy drops him into the chasm like he does in the original chapter. Either way, the outcome is the same. Gremmy closes the crack in the ground shut, trapping Kenpachi and Yachiru in an enclosed space full of water. However, Kenpachi bursts out of the ground. Now, a small moment from the source material is cut here again, where a wayward chunk of stone hurtles towards Gremmy, but he deletes it immediately using his power. And the captain attempts then to slash the Sternritter, only for Gremmy to summon a pillar to block his path at the last second. It's here that Kenpachi has figured out another weakness of Gremmy's. The Sternritter has to be focused on what he wants to use his imagination on, or else the effect is reversed. When he takes his mind off Yachiru, her bones then return to normal, though still broken, as Kenpachi tells Yachiru to get her arm healed later. As chapter 575 begins, we see Askin Naklavar watching the battle from afar through a pair of binoculars. I'm, of course, really pleased to see him here, but it's definitely a shame his scene has been completely gutted. In the anime, Askin muses about how society looks down on those who do nothing but dream, but when you see someone who can do anything with their imagination, it makes you realise how much more peaceful it was beforehand. However, that's merely his final parting comment in the original chapter. In the source material, there's a comedic element to this scene, as we see that Askin bailed on his fight with Mayuri and is now just having a sandwich out of a picnic basket while watching the battle. Askin is impressed that Kenpachi is able to go against Gremmy, revealing he's also aware of Kenpachi's reputation. As he relaxes, however, Askin wonders why Yhwach released Gremmy in the first place when he's approached from behind by Sternritter L. Pepe Wakabrada. Now, I know that Pepe is little more than a joke these days to most people, but back in the day, this was a really exciting back and forth. We didn't really know anything excited to see him here. He, along with Askin, was being built up as one of the Sternritter to Askin says that Pepe's a monster as well. Pepe agrees, but counters by saying Askin is too. Askin then gets up to leave, saying he doesn't want to stick around when Gremmy's about to cause a ridiculous catastrophe. Pepe agrees that they're not safe even at this distance, at which point Askin then says his line from the episode as he walks away. Like I said, while of course I appreciate Askin being included in the episode at all, the anime team clearly wants the audience to have FaceTime with him, seeing as he is a major Sternritter. This being removed completely is definitely a net negative overall. It gives a great interaction between two villains, but perhaps more importantly for this fight, it helps to build up Gremmy as a truly terrifying force. While we haven't seen anything yet, Askin's words foreshadow the incredible events to come. Seeing these two concerned about being anywhere near Gremmy is great. In fact, they both think he deserves to be locked up forever, which is very ominous indeed, to say about your own teammate. With all of this context completely gone, as I said earlier, Gremmy can't help but just kind of feel like another Sternritter, instead of an unpredictable and completely unstable monster, a ticking time bomb that they're all just waiting to go off. As a side note, considering what we know about Pepe and his evil nature, I'm kind of surprised he didn't just hit Askin with a love kiss from behind and try to take him under his control. He seemed to surprise Askin, so presumably the Sternritter didn't realise there was anyone else there, and that feels like the sort of thing Pepe would do. Maybe he figured if it somehow went badly for him, Askin would easily kill him and it wasn't worth the risk. However, as we return to the fight, Kenpachi orders Yachiru to find Isane and get her arm healed, and she leaves the stage, before Kenpachi questions what Gremmy even wants to achieve from this, what he actually wants to do with them. This is another great moment for Kenpachi that's left intact here in the episode. He barks that surely Gremmy wants to fight, as if he's the strongest Quincy, then he should surely want to crush the strongest Shinigami. But of course, that thought has never occurred to Gremmy until now. He's finally starting to emerge from his shell at KENPACHI'S urging. KENPACHI then launches himself at Gremmy, but Gremmy summons a barrage of stone to pummel and crush the captain, slamming into him from all sides. As KENPACHI smashes them to pieces, we get a bit of introspection from Gremmy that thankfully is again left intact, and explains a lot about his demeanour and his approach to the battle. Despite being the strongest, he's never felt the urge to fight or crush anyone. Everyone in the Vandenreich has always kept him at arm's length, and in response he's never felt the need to crush anyone, as he's always believed everyone knows and respects him as the strongest of them anyway. Though it's tough luck that that belief of his that he never needed to kill anyone didn't also apply to Gwenael too. As the desire to finally throw off the shackles and fight builds and builds inside of him, Gremmy's face comes alive for the first time in the battle as he truly awakens. He truly emerges, both literally from the safe confines of his massive hood, his face finally being properly revealed, and figuratively. And he wants to take KENPACHI down in a fair fight to finally get the chance to prove himself. In this sense, he's the anti-KENPACHI. Virtually zero battle experience, and at least until it's torn out of him by KENPACHI's words, zero bloodlust. He has no desire to fight or do anything really, which is the ultimate irony of his character. He can do anything, but he has been living a meaningless existence supposedly at the top, when in reality he's trapped in a cage of both Yhwach's physical making and his own mentality. It's actually really good stuff for a character who is quite short-lived. Gremmy summons an array of guns and blasts KENPACHI, who, by the way, must have no idea what these things are, before unleashing several missiles at the captain too in a fireball explosion. The guns, while CG, actually look pretty good, I think, and the whole scene is framed in a cool way, though again, I think there should be some music here. This is actually a bombastic moment in the fight, and it needed something to help spice it up even more. As we reach the end of 575, KENPACHI slices one of the missiles in two, causing it to blow up in Gremmy's face and forcing him to finally use his hand to shield himself. With a demonic grin creeping across his face, Gremmy finally looks ready to enjoy an actual fight worthy of the two of them, and KENPACHI leaps into battle to meet him. Gremmy seals himself within a metal dome, but KENPACHI bursts right through it, driving his sword into Gremmy's shoulder in a shower of blood. However, Gremmy closes up his wound with KENPACHI's sword still in it, making KENPACHI unable to retrieve it. With KENPACHI trapped, Gremmy crushes him beneath an enormous stone hand that drops out of the sky, but the captain simply slices his way out of it, cutting Gremmy again at the same time. Gremmy suddenly realises he's being too slow. In the time it takes him to notice and heal his wounds, KENPACHI has already sliced him again, and Gremmy is viciously savaged by the captain, blood spurting out everywhere. In his head, Gremmy begins to falter, wallowing in despair as he realises he's going to lose. And his voice actor does an amazing job at conveying his crazed desperation in that moment too. However, KENPACHI stops just short of killing the Sternritter, realising something is wrong. Gremmy has locked up, he has withdrawn in on himself again upon beginning to imagine himself losing and struggling to deal with that reality. As KENPACHI talks Gremmy out of essentially killing himself with his own power, Gremmy then resolves to win by any means necessary. Thanking KENPACHI as he cleanses himself of all of his wounds in one go, Gremmy states that now he will never die, as he instantly creates another version of himself. It's cool seeing the second Gremmy just blink into life. It really emphasises how effortlessly Gremmy is able to do something completely incredible, godlike even. Like I mentioned before, it's interesting to me that Gwenael is by far and away the most impressive thing Gremmy creates, yes, including the Meteor, but Gremmy just does away with him like he's nothing. Presumably Gremmy imagined this well thought out, comprehensive ability set for Gwen AL2, and he just does away with it. Gremmy then reveals his ultimate trump card as Kenpachi tries to strike him. He's made it so he's impossible to cut, though Kenpachi claims to be able to cut anything, so would this still stop him if he kept trying? But even more than that, Gremmy is now capable of greater feats of imagination as a colossal meteor explodes into life in the sky, parting the clouds in a ripple of flame and light. However, as the meteor swallows up and eclipses the sky behind them, approaching the Seirete, bringing with it the threat of annihilation, Kenpachi lifts his blade to his face and exclaims that cutting a meteor will be very exciting, revealing the name of his zanpakuto at last. Nozarashi. So, as we move into chapter 577, much has been made of the many missing reactions here, and I want to give my 2 cents. The anime removes a lot of content from this chapter. Before the meteor even strikes the Shakon Maku in the chapter, we see Basby watching the fireball approaching in horror, realising immediately that this must be Gremmy's work. From below, Pepe looks on, shielding his face with his staff, while Soldat and Shinigami stop in their tracks to watch in disbelief. Renji can't understand what he's seeing, while Askin, sweating nervously, can't believe this is even possible, reiterating once again that this is why Gremmy should have stayed locked away. The Shinigami officers remain confident that the Shakon Maku will destroy the meteor on impact. However, it's simply too big and has too much mass, and it forces its way through the barrier, the total destruction of Seirete seemingly unstoppable. Watching the Shinigami try and rationalise their escape before they fall into total despair and panic was a great moment in the original chapter. Both Shinigami and Soldat completely abandon the battle to turn tail and run for their lives, while Hashwolf demands that some Soldat protect Yuhabuk, as the Quincy King merely stands on the edge of the battlements as if to challenge the meteor to try and destroy him. It is a big shame these moments are gone from the episode. I've seen a lot of what feels like knee-jerk discourse going around about the reactions being cut, including people saying things like they're pointless and it doesn't matter, but I'd argue those people don't understand what it means to set a scene, or to build a world, or to even have stakes in a narrative. But removing this sequence lessens the scope of Kenpachi versus Gremmy massively. This is precisely what the source material was building towards with Gremmy all along, why the Sternritter were so concerned about him being set free, and is the natural crescendo for both his character and the trajectory of the battle. Originally, he was very sheltered, barely wanting to even move from the spot, but now his battle-loving, bloodlusted self has been drawn out like poison from a wound. But, child that he is, he's taken it too far, and with such incredible power in the hands of someone so infantile, all of Seirete is about to perish as a result. I think it's fair to say that both friend and foe would be pretty concerned about that, and it's only reasonable that we see how this battle is affecting everyone else. The only reaction I personally would have cut is Hashwolf telling the Soldat to protect Yuhabuk, as I always thought it was nonsense. I mean, what exactly does he expect them to do that Yuhabuk can't do himself? Anyway, there's a really cool visual in the anime where, upon striking the Shakon Maku, the meteor parts the shadowy veil almost like a liquid, which doesn't happen at all in the source material. And as Gremmy announces that there's nothing Kenpachi can do to stop the meteor now, even if he did somehow manage to kill him, it looks like it's all over. Not just for this fight, but for every single person there. The next sequence is handled extremely well in the episode. Honestly, it's basically perfect in the way it looks, in the way it's been adapted from the page, and I think, of course, it was very important they got it right. The camera swoops in, focusing on Kenpachi's enormous grin as the light from the meteor coats him in gold. He rushes forwards, dragging his zanpakuto. We get a brief flashback of his first meeting with Yachiru, which has been completely remade to look similar to his first meeting with Unohana. It's details like these, where it's clear extra effort has been taken, that I really appreciate about the anime. As Kenpachi drags his blade along the surface of the meteor, there's another wonderful moment where for a brief second he transforms back into his child self. A realization of the same elation he felt so long ago, back when he battled Unohana. It's also perhaps supposed to reference that he's finally returned to that unfettered state once again, and as a result is able to carve the Meteor in two with ease. And so Kenpachi cleaves the Meteor in two in a stunning spectacle, one of the best looking scenes of the core without a doubt. With a flash of light, the Meteor is split in two before it explodes violently high above the Seirete, sending a shockwave of light and fire barreling across the sky. Now, due to the fact that they cut a fair bit out of this Meteor sequence, the Meteor barely feels like it's around for more than a few minutes tops, but thankfully that whole sequence is handled very well at least. Chunks of the Meteor rain down on the cityscape below as Gremmy looks on in shock at Kenpachi's brand new Shikai, Nozarashi. The enormous blade rests upon his shoulder as the molten rock rains down from the sky behind him. It really does look fantastic. The anime team did an excellent job here. Gremmy's reaction to the Meteor's destruction is slimmed down, where originally he can't believe Kenpachi destroyed the entire thing in one go. Interestingly, the Veil of Shadows closes itself back up again behind Kenpachi. It's a shame the next great shot of Kenpachi holding Nozarashi in the chapter is removed from the episode, instead focusing on a close-up of his face. But as we begin chapter 578, Gremmy goes on the offensive again, surrounding Kenpachi with numerous versions of himself. Again, this next sequence looks amazing. Kenpachi prepares to swing Nozarashi, but the many different Gremmys fire up their next assault, summoning a shroud of the void of space itself. It would have been cool if all of the sound just totally cut out when Kenpachi found himself in outer space, but regardless, this is again handled extremely well. Kenpachi's bodily fluids begin to evaporate, bursting out of his chest, mouth and eyes as the battle reaches its absolute pinnacle. As Gremmy gloats that Kenpachi will die a terrible death, the captain bursts free of space itself, slicing through the Sternritter, who had forgotten to harden his body once again. However, Gremmy has a bomb attached to him and every other version of himself as well, each of them clinging on to Kenpachi before detonating in a huge blue blast that engulfs the captain in a mammoth fireball. All of this is pretty much identical to the source material, but again, I'll reiterate my kneecapped and it suddenly ends abruptly. As Kenpachi emerges from the smoke, he definitely looks more injured in the source material, I think, but either way, Gremmy decides to finish him off by imagining himself stronger than Kenpachi. I mistakenly thought the soundtrack playing here was Soundscape to Our Door during my live reaction, but it's actually Slip Away, the remix of Never Meant to Belong that also played last week when Rukia activated Bankai. As Gremmy's body morphs and mutates to try and accommodate Kenpachi's massive power, he rushes towards him, desperate to prove himself to the captain. While I do think this ending is somewhat anticlimactic, I think it actually does work better here in the anime than it did in the original chapter. I like seeing Gremmy reaching out for Kenpachi only for his fingers to... Gremmy found a reason to live, and that resulted in his death. He found someone worth challenging and wanted to prove himself to them, but it was just too much for him to handle. I also like that it wasn't necessarily Kenpachi's strength that killed Gremmy, but Gremmy's own almost childlike perception of the monster that Kenpachi can be. Kenpachi even says as much when he says that you turned me into a monster in your own head. Throughout the fight, witnessing Kenpachi's incredible feats of combat, Gremmy built Kenpachi up to be this totally unassailable mountain, and as a result couldn't fathom being strong enough to overcome him. This is where the episode technically comes to an end, but there's a post-credit scene too. As we arrive at chapter 579 and the end of volume 64 essentially, Kenpachi confronts the dying Gremmy on the ground. Gremmy tries to rationalize his defeat, claiming he imagined everything perfectly. It was just his body that failed him. But realizing that he's making excuses for losing despite his imagination, Gremmy laments that he actually wanted to win this one. Suddenly his body explodes and a brain in a jar comes flying out, landing on the rubble behind him. This was, back in the day, absolutely just one of the absolute strangest twists I think Kubo has ever pulled. I remember turning the page and thinking, what on earth is going on here? How is he capping off this absolutely mad fight with something even stranger? And for better or for worse, this scene is handled in the same way as the source material, so we're probably not going to be able to glean any extra information about the brain whatsoever. It's clearly Gremmy's true form, and the prevailing theory is that he is the brain of the Soul King, which would explain the unbelievable power of the Visionary, but it would have been nice to have gotten some kind of confirmation. Maybe we'll hear a little more about Gremmy next week, though it does seem unlikely to me. Gremmy then reveals that even his body is just a product of his imagination as it begins to fade away. This scene does look really nice and even strangely serene and tranquil in the anime as Gremmy turns to dust. Nothing but icy blue, crystalline Quincy Reiatsu floating away on the wind. One thing I still don't understand though is why this means that Gremmy, the brain, has to die. If it even does die. If the brain is the core, the true being, the nexus, and Gremmy as we know him is just a fake constructed body, an outer shell of sorts, then why does the destruction of the shell mean the end of the brain? The brain looks pretty intact to me, considering it's sitting pretty comfortably inside a pristine jar. Gremmy's last words express a deep sadness at going to a place where he won't be able to imagine anything anymore, but I've never understood why that is. If the child known as Gremmy is just yet another of the brain's many creations, then why isn't it able to conjure up another body to replace him? Although we can't be sure, presumably Gremmy was always just this brain in a jar before he made himself that body that we see, that we're acquainted with, so I'm not sure why he can't just do it again. I understand that trying to envision KENPACHI'S power wreck